The first chill of autumn settled upon London with a heaviness that seemed to mirror the weight in Clarissa Worthington's heart. Leaves tumbled from the sycamores along Wimpole Street, their fragile descent carried by winds that whispered of endings. In her modest townhouse, the daughter of once hopeful parents sat at a small escritoire, quill poised above parchment that remained obstinately blank. Ink stained her fingertips, a testament to hours spent drafting, discarding, and redrafting letters that no family of reputation would ever answer. To seek employment as a governess was humiliation enough for a woman of her station, but to have her name attached to scandal, however false, rendered each petition a futile plea. She knew, even before the wax cooled on each envelope, that the silence of society's disdain would be her only reply. 3 years had passed since that fateful Thursday when innocence had been stolen not by deed, but by rumour. She could still hear Adelaide Pétion's trembling voice, artfully pitched to draw sympathy, declaring that her dearest friend had attempted to seduce her husband. Clarissa's protestations had dissolved like mist before the blaze of Adelaide's manufactured tears. The truth, that Adelaide had chosen betrayal over honesty, sacrifice over loyalty, mattered little to the glittering salons of Mayfair. In that world, appearances were coin, and Clarissa's purse had been emptied in a single evening. She remembered with painful clarity the abrupt silence that followed her disgrace. Invitations ceased to arrive. The carriages that once stopped at her door rolled past without slowing, and acquaintances who had once embraced her with airy kisses now crossed the street to avoid even the brush of her gown. Her betrothed, George Hartley, had retreated with cowardly haste, his carefully worded letter of withdrawal offering no explanation but making plain that his ambition outweighed any affection. Clarissa had burned it unread, though she could recite every cruel word from memory. Her parents, too, had succumbed to society's ruthless judgment. Though they whispered their belief in her innocence, their nerves could not withstand the cold shoulders and poisoned whispers that followed them in drawing-rooms and promenades. They retreated to their small estate in Devonshire, leaving Clarissa with a modest allowance and the London house, an empty stage for a play that would never again be performed. The townhouse, once filled with laughter, had grown hollow. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo with accusation, reminding her with every chime of the life she had lost. What hurt most was not the abandonment itself, but the revelation that love and loyalty could be so cheaply bought. Friends she had nursed through fevers, families she had aided in times of difficulty, all turned from her without hesitation, as though decency demanded cruelty when gossip offered it an excuse. Clarissa's heart, once quick to trust, learned the necessity of armour. Each morning she donned her veil as though it were a knight's helm, concealing her features not merely from the cold, but from the gaze of a city that delighted in remembering her shame. There were nights, endless nights, when the fire crackled in vain against the frost that seeped into her bones. She would sit by the window, watching fog curl like ghosts around the lamplighters as they made their rounds, and wonder if she existed at all. A shadow in her own life, a phantom haunting rooms once bright with promise. Letters of petition piled upon her desk, each a monument to futility. Schools rejected her with polite but decisive notes, their words dripping with unspoken disdain. Unsuitable, they said. Untrustworthy, though never allowed. Mothers could not entrust their daughters' morals to a woman whispered to have enticed another's husband, however false the tale. And so Clarissa's world narrowed. The library became her sanctuary, her only companions, the volumes that had once formed the substance of her education. She devoured histories, philosophies, novels, anything to silence the echo of solitude. Yet even as she read, the words seemed to mock her. Heroines who found love after trials, heroes who defended virtue against lies, their triumphs rang hollow when her own life had been stripped of even the possibility of vindication. It was in this state of weary resignation that she received a letter unlike any other. The hand was bold, the script firm, and the seal bore no crest of nobility, but the simple impression of a merchant's ring. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, recently returned from India, requested her service as a governess for his daughters. Yet it was not the offer itself that startled her, but the curious phrasing. He sought a woman of complicated reputation, someone who understood the cruelty of society's judgments and the possibility of redemption. Clarissa read those words again and again, scarcely believing them. Redemption. The word struck her like a bell in the silence of a long-abandoned chapel. Could such a thing still exist for her? Her fingers trembled as she set the letter aside, fear mingling with hope in equal measure. Hope was dangerous. She had trained herself to expect only disappointment, for to hope was to invite despair. And yet, something within her stirred. Perhaps it was the memory of a time before ruin, when her laughter had been easy and her future secure, or perhaps it was simply the desperate instinct of survival, clutching at any rope cast into her storm. Meanwhile, elsewhere in London, another soul lived in quiet exile. Lord Edmund Blackthorne, once a man of influence and promise, now wore his disgrace like a brand across his brow. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair dark, save for the streaks of silver at his temples, he cut a figure both formidable and solitary. His eyes, grey as thunderclouds, had once shone with the confidence of a man secure in his place among England's elite. Now they bore the weary watchfulness of one who expected betrayal at every turn. His sin had not been invention, but truth. When he discovered his wife in the arms of his cousin, Edmund had committed the unpardonable act of seeking a parliamentary divorce. The proceedings had dragged through 2 bitter years, costing him nearly half his fortune and all his social standing. In the end, it was he, the wronged husband, who bore the weight of disgrace, while his wife flourished as a mistress in Parisian salons. Society, ever hypocritical, forgave the adulteress while condemning the man who refused to endure her treachery in silence. Clubs expelled him, acquaintances shunned him, his family, led by an unyielding mother, erased his name from polite mention. Only his widowed sister, Isabella, maintained a trickle of correspondence, though even she did so in defiance of matriarchal command. Thus Edmund passed his days in Bloomsbury, surrounded by books and bitterness, watching the world with sardonic detachment. His pride remained, but pride was a poor companion in the still hours of dawn. The letter from Josiah Blackwood had intrigued him precisely because it did not reek of pity. The merchant spoke plainly. He sought a tutor for his son, a man who had suffered scandal not through vice, but through society's hypocrisy. Blackwood intended to gather a household of the discarded, individuals who might teach his children the value of integrity over appearances. Edmund almost laughed aloud at the notion. Integrity had cost him everything. Yet something in the frankness of the offer, the audacity of a man who dared to defy the ton's opinions, stirred a long, silent ember. Against his better judgment, he agreed. And so, by the strange weaving of fate, two exiles prepared to step once more into the world, not to reclaim society's favor, but to find in obscurity what the glittering ballrooms had denied them. Clarissa, veiled and cautious, gathered her courage like armor. Edmund, grim yet curious, steeled himself for an encounter he could not yet name. Neither knew that their paths were destined to collide, that their scars would mirror each other so closely as to become indistinguishable. For now, each carried the weight of ruin alone. She, the spinster, condemned for a lie; he, the lord, condemned for truth. Two lives shattered by scandal, two hearts frozen by betrayal. And yet, within that desolation lay the seed of something neither dared to imagine: salvation not from society, but from each other. This is only the first part, about 1,300 words. To reach 3,000 words, I will need to continue expanding with Clarissa's deeper reflections on betrayal and survival, Edmund's private loneliness, memories of his former life, the atmosphere of London as a metaphor for their exile. A slow build of tension toward their first encounter. The morning sky over Grosvenor Square was the colour of watered milk, the pale light flattening the angles of townhouses built to impress. Clarissa stood at the curb, one gloved hand tight around the reticule that held Mr. Blackwood's letter, and watched her hired hackney rattle away. In the faint reflection of a window, she saw how carefully she had arranged herself, veil settled, bonnet tied precisely, posture composed to suggest a woman who had not been broken by whispers. Beneath the neat surface, her heartbeat went about its desperate work, quick and persistent, as though courage could be summoned by rhythm alone. She drew in a breath, scented faintly with damp stone and coal smoke, and mounted the steps. The door opened before she could lift the knocker. A butler, tall and grave, with that particular stillness possessed by men who had managed grand houses all their lives, bowed her inside. The entrance hall was expansive and unapologetically new. Marble gleamed beneath her boots, an ambitious chandelier glittered above, and the brass of the banisters shone as if polished by competition. Yet even in this temple to English aspiration, there was an undercurrent of elsewhere. The air carried a suggestion of sandalwood and lime peel, something bright and resinous that did not belong to London's soot and starch. "Miss Worthington," the butler intoned, not a flicker of judgment crossing his face, for which she was absurdly grateful. "If you will follow me, madam." He led her past niches that held porcelain pagodas and bronze figures whose forms were both unfamiliar and serene, down a corridor papered in a palm motif that managed to be tasteful and faintly rebellious, and into a morning room that faced a small but meticulously arranged garden. A tray had been prepared, china of excellent quality, slices of lemon, a small silver jug beaded with moisture, and a clock on the mantel ticked with the confidence of new money. Clarissa stood where she was shown, and tried not to think of all the luxurious rooms she had left behind in another life. That was a different story. This was an interview. She realized, with a little start of nerves, that she was early. The notepaper embedded in the butler's neat tone, "If you will, madam," suggested her arrival had been anticipated to the minute. She moved to the window and let her gaze rest on the bare espalier of a pear against the garden wall, a pattern of patient training and promise, and attempted to cultivate the same. The door opened again. She turned and found not the master of the house but another applicant. The impression struck her all at once, like a chord. Tall, spare, the set of a soldier about the shoulders, though his attire was rigorously civilian, hair dark with a thread of silver at each temple, a profile that might once have been drawn by a caricaturist as cruelly handsome and now had settled into something more interesting, a man's face, weathered by choice and consequence. His eyes met hers, grey, cool, assessing, and in the matched instant of recognition she knew exactly who he was. Lord Edmund Blackthorne, society's cautionary tale. The husband who had refused to make a pact with humiliation, who had chosen truth and paid in coin and solitude and contempt. She had never spoken to him, had never been introduced, but in the strange fraternity of the outcast, reputations moved like weather. A name became a direction. Beware, do not stare, cross the street, do not speak. And here he stood, unexpectedly, where her own unlikely reprieve might be decided. He bowed, properly. "Miss Worthington," he said, as if they had met at any number of dull assemblies. His voice surprised her by being low and unhurried, a sound that belonged less to the clubs of St. James than to a library in which long arguments were permitted to breathe. "Lord Blackthorne." She was glad of the veil. It gave her the fiction of privacy. "Mr. Blackwood bids you both good morning," said the butler, who had materialized again with the noiseless authority of his kind. "He will join you directly. Tea?" They murmured assent. Cups were poured, lemon offered, sugar placed nearer to Clarissa than to Edmund, as if the house itself assumed her need of sweetness, and then they were alone, two ruins propped up in a very fine room. Silence did its nervous work. Clarissa focused on not gripping her saucer too tightly. She could feel his presence, a restrained vitality, like a musician holding a bow above strings. "It appears," he said at last, with a faint shade of irony that did not quite disguise something like weariness, "that Mr. Blackwood values efficiency. I was not informed that our interviews would be concurrent." "Nor I," Clarissa replied. She wondered whether to thank him for using the word interview, as if she were anything but a supplicant. She wondered why the impulse to gratitude should sting. Perhaps he wishes to observe how we bear awkwardness. Then he is a man of acute understanding. The corner of his mouth shifted, no smile exactly, but the ghost of one. "You find awkwardness intolerable, Miss Worthington?" She considered. "I find that one becomes practised at it, my lord, the way one becomes practised at cold. One never loves it, but one learns how to move while inside it." Something altered in his gaze, not pity, he did not seem capable of that insult, but recognition. He would know the cold. He lived in it. She set down her cup before the door opened once more, and the room shifted around its rightful centre. Josiah Blackwood was a man built for commerce and contradiction. He possessed the calm of someone who expected to be obeyed, and the humour of someone who preferred to persuade. 50, perhaps, weathered as sailors are weathered, his skin holding a memory of stronger suns. His clothes were London's newest, but there was an ease in the way he wore them, as if he disdained to perform costume. When he took Clarissa's hand, he did not pretend not to notice the faint tremor. When he greeted Edmund, he did so with the exact balance of respect, due a lord, and frankness due a fellow exile. "Miss Worthington, Lord Blackthorne, thank you for coming." He gestured them to sit without assuming he had the right to command it. "I have erred on the side of candour in my letters. I will continue. I returned from Bombay 3 months ago with my family and a fortune, and discovered that the one is more keenly admired than the other. London will forgive you anything if you dine properly and say nothing inconvenient. I am not suited to either art." Edmund's brows lifted, just enough to register interest. Clarissa listened, feeling how the room warmed around the merchant's unfeigned will. "My children," Blackwood went on, "are not suited to it either. They are clever, curious, and unpracticed at English hypocrisies. I mean to prepare them for the world as it is, without crushing what is best in them. To that end, I intend my household to be deliberate. I do not want people who have never been wrong or wronged. I want people who have survived. You have both survived." It might have been flattery if it had been said with softer eyes. As it was, it felt like a ledger entry. You were broken. You are still standing. Clarissa, against habit, raised her gaze fully to meet his. "And you believe," she said, "that the broken make the best teachers. I believe that the unbroken make the most dangerous ones." He spoke without heat. "I have had tutors who mistook ignorance for innocence, and governesses who taught fear under the name of prudence. I should prefer my daughters be taught by a woman who has learned the cost of another's lie, and yet retains her dignity. And my son by a man who would rather lose half his income and all his invitations than keep his name clean by keeping his soul silent." He turned to Edmund, not apologizing for the bluntness. "What I am purchasing is not merely skill, Lord Blackthorne. It is example." Clarissa felt something in her chest loosen and ache in the same moment. It was dangerous to be seen. To be seen with accuracy was intoxicating and terrible. Blackwood sat back. "The work is straightforward in its structure and complicated in its spirit. Miss Worthington, my daughters, Margaret, 14, cleverer than I like in a girl; Josephine, 12, more practical than is convenient; Harriet, 8, pure wildfire; Lord Blackthorne, my son Thomas, 15, brilliant and restless. They are to be equipped for England without being made ashamed of India. They will speak their minds without forgetting their manners. They will read Marcus Aurelius and Mrs. Barbauld. They will learn Latin declensions, and also how to ask a question another's pride cannot refuse. I pay well. I insist on propriety. I will not dismiss competent people to please vicious ones." He might have been discussing contracts. He might have been offering shelter. Clarissa set her gloved hands together in her lap. "Mr. Blackwood, I am grateful for your frankness. It compels me to be frank in turn. My presence here will cause you trouble." "Everything worth doing does," Blackwood returned, with the cheerfulness of a man who had carried spice against monsoon. "You will live on the 3rd floor, with your own sitting room. You will be treated with respect by every person under this roof, or they will seek work elsewhere. You will be seen to your room by the housekeeper after breakfast, and begin in the schoolroom at 9. If you remain, you will not teach my daughters to be timid." Her throat tightened. She had not realized how much she had feared the clause that always came in any offer, that cyclical sentence turning admiration into supervision. If you remain, you will keep your head down. You will be grateful without being visible. You will earn your way back into nothing. Here, the condition offered was honor. Edmund spoke, his voice more measured than she would have managed. "And I, Mr. Blackwood, what is the condition for me?" "That you will treat my son as a mind, not a spine to be stiffened, and that you will not attempt to teach him that silence is the price of membership." The faintest glint of humor lit the merchant's gaze. "You may, of course, teach him to sit properly and not to interrupt ladies, the latter especially." Blackwood rose, and when they did as well, he did not yet dismiss them. "One more thing. London is listening to this house. I have given it something to hear. He glanced at the clock, which chimed the quarter. "It is my wife's idea that I invite those who trade rather than those who tattle, merchants, artists, the odd scholar, people who have had to learn the difference between ornament and worth. If you accept, you will be at my table not as curiosities, but as colleagues. I would like my children to see that there are rooms to which admission is not bought with cowardice." He took a breath that seemed to brighten him from within. "Now I will send for the children. If they do not frighten you, nothing will." When he left the room, taking with him the hum of purpose, stillness returned with a new shape. Clarissa adjusted the set of her veil without thinking. She could feel Edmund's attention, the way one senses a fire behind one's back. He moved first, crossing to the mantel as if to examine the clock, and spoke without turning, which felt, blessedly, like an offered privacy. "Do you," he said, "mean to accept?" The question cracked open all the fear she had kept folded. "My lord," she answered, "I do not think I can afford not to." "Afford?" he repeated softly, as if tasting what the word had become for them both. "Mr. Blackwood's experiment may suit us." Then, after a pause that was almost gentleness, "You will find that the housekeeper can be relied upon. Any respectable house is governed by one woman's invisible empire." It startled a small laugh from her, and she did not think she had laughed genuinely in months. Before she could reply, there came a flurry at the door, and the quiet was broken by life. They entered misarranged by eagerness. Thomas first, tall and all elbows, his boots carrying the dirt of a boy who had outrun buggies and expectations. Margaret a step behind, neat, intelligent, already chief of a household that did not yet know it. Josephine with a pencil behind her ear and a ribbon trailing like an afterthought. Harriet last, who did not enter at all, but burst like a thought that would not be restrained. Their mother followed, slender and keen-eyed, her sari turned into a shawl across English silk. No accident, Clarissa suspected, but a thesis. "Miss Worthington," Mrs. Blackwood said, taking Clarissa's hand with that efficient warmth practiced by women who have delivered both babies and parties, "we are so pleased." There was no pretence in the words. "Lord Blackthorne." She curtsied, not deeply, but with a respect that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with choices. Harriet had already sidled to Clarissa's side and peered up into the veil. "Are you a mystery?" she asked, with unruined frankness. "Harriet," Margaret murmured, with adolescent mortification. "I am," Clarissa said, surprising herself, "but not a very complicated one." "Then we shall solve you quickly," the child declared, as if that settled the matter, and promptly took Clarissa's hand with the imperious ease of a queen. Introductions done, Blackwood allowed his progeny to interrogate their future. Thomas asked Edmund if there would be Euclid, and whether Latin could be endured by translating anything worth reading. Josephine wanted to know if, under Miss Worthington, a girl might be permitted to learn algebra beyond the vulgar fractions of a lady's education. Margaret wished to understand what books would be in the schoolroom, and whether she might be allowed to annotate them. Harriet pressed her nose to the window and announced that the pear tree needed stories if it was to ripen properly, and would Miss Worthington please begin telling one this afternoon. Clarissa found that her answers came more easily than she had expected, as if a door she had been pressing against with all her strength had swung open as soon as she stopped bracing. Yes, there would be Euclid, and also poetry, because a mind must be both precise and spacious. Yes, there would be algebra if Josephine would agree to demonstrate to Harriet that numbers could be coaxed into behaving by kindness as well as by threat. Yes, there would be annotations, but they would be argued aloud so the margin did not become a secret. She heard her own voice and knew it again, steady, wry, patient, the voice of a woman who had not, in fact, been destroyed. Edmund, for his part, handled Thomas with an economy that doubled as respect. Latin, he said, is a means. There are many. We will use it until it ceases to be the most efficient one for the problem at hand. Thomas grinned, quick and conspiratorial. Euclid is not a collection of torments. It is a language for understanding why a bridge will not fall. If you do not believe me, we will go watch the Masons on Hanover Square and let them persuade you. It did not escape Clarissa that the boy's shoulders, so used to a bracing that implied correction was imminent, dropped by a fractional and meaningful degree. It is astonishing how little it takes to teach a child he is not perpetually at fault. Mrs. Blackwood observed from a distance that was not distance at all. When the children had been satisfied that their futures would not be a jail, she crossed to Clarissa and, with the sort of deftness that can rescue dinners and reputations alike, set her at ease. "You will find," she said softly, "that the house is not entirely English. My husband insists on good linen and punctual meals. I insist on spiced tea at 4 and truth at any hour. If anyone requires you to lower your eyes when you speak to them, they will no longer be in my employ." She examined Clarissa's veil, not rudely, but as a seamstress might examine the fall of a collar. "Wear it if it guards your peace. Remove it if it burdens your breath." No one had ever framed the matter as choice. Clarissa's fingers hovered at the edge of the gauze and then fell. "Thank you," she said simply. Blackwood, who had allowed all this to run as easily as a canal at full tide, concluded with a general benevolence that could not disguise the precision beneath. "We will begin tomorrow," he said. 9 o'clock. Cook believes that children learn better when they smell cinnamon, so there will be buns. Mr. Holroyd, the butler, who was indeed an empire, will see you out. Miss Worthington, Mrs. Henderson will show you your rooms upstairs now if you would like them. Lord Blackthorne, you will find the schoolroom sufficient, but if you want more maps I can get them. We do not economize on maps." He smiled in a way that made his weathered face suddenly charming. "The world is larger than London. People here require proof." The party dissolved with the chaos that attends beginnings. Harriet demanded to carry Clarissa's reticule. Josephine volunteered to write a schedule. Margaret promised to locate a globe. Thomas offered Edmund a solemn handshake that transformed halfway through into something like a conspiracy. Clarissa found herself following the housekeeper, a practical woman whose face suggested she knew every secret in the house and would share none, up a staircase where the runner yielded with expensive discretion underfoot. On the 3rd floor, the rooms were bright and private. The sitting-room's window gave onto chimneys and a sliver of sky. The bedroom held a bed large enough to be a promise of sleep rather than a suggestion of duty. There was a small bookcase, currently innocent, patient for a new order of volumes. Mrs. Henderson moved through the rooms, adjusting nothing and discovering everything, as housekeepers do. She opened the wardrobe. Fresh laundered linens breathed a clean comfort. She touched the grate, already laid with the morning's coal. She indicated the bell rope and the writing desk. "If you require anything," she said, "you will ring. If you do not ring, I shall come anyway for the first few days. because people who have been badly used forget that bells are for them. When the door closed and Clarissa stood alone amid the quiet, she placed both hands upon the edge of the desk and let her head fall for one unguarded moment. Not in despair, in the difficult gratitude that feels perilously like grief. Gratitude for rooms that were not a prison, for a child's hand in hers without suspicion, for a man's voice that had spoken to her without calculation, for the possibility, narrow as a keyhole, that she might build a life with planks and nails instead of with memories. She unpinned her veil and draped it over the chair. The gesture felt both like treason and like breathing. She crossed to the window and looked down at the mews, at the boy leading a horse, at the woman with a basket of laundry, at the ordinary work of a city that would not stop to see whether she rose or fell. The thought steadied her. The world did not end because a woman's reputation did. It went on. And a woman might go on within it, not in the way she had once been promised, glittering, but in the way people who make and mend go on, steadily, without applause, intimately, beautifully. Below, in the schoolroom, Edmund stood alone after the house's energy had dispersed, and examined the table where tomorrow's lessons would begin. He glanced toward the corridor down which the children had vanished, and an expression crossed his face that would have shocked the portraitists who had once painted him in oils, something like tenderness without indulgence. He was not foolish enough to imagine that the walls of this household could keep out malice. Nothing in London served as a perfect fortification against bad faith. But for the first time in years, he felt that he was entering a fight worth the bruises. On the mantel, a small brass compass lay in a dish, abandoned by some child, impatient to navigate only the next game. Edmund picked it up by habit, and held it until the needle steadied. He had not needed an instrument to tell him when his life had deviated. He had known it, the way one knows when the wind changes. But a compass has this virtue. It recognizes that wandering is not the same thing as being lost. He set it down and turned when footsteps sounded at the door. Josiah Blackwood paused on the threshold, as if reluctant to interfere with a man's first private inventory of a new field of battle. "My wife says you handled Thomas as one handles a skittish foal, firmly, and without calling him a horse." "Thank you." "He is not a horse," Edmund said. Then, after a second, because he had learned that certain jokes are the first planks laid across a gulf, "though I may assign him to read Xenophon on horsemanship, you may assign him to read anything, if you make him believe he asked for it." Blackwood stepped into the room and leaned a hip against the table. "May I be impertinent?" "I believe you have been consistently impertinent since you wrote to me," Edmund said dryly. "Excellent. Consistency is a virtue in trade." The merchant regarded him with frank goodwill. "When I was a young man, I had a ship founder in a storm between Bombay and Muscat. The captain saved us because he had never believed the sea owed him calm. Do not expect calm here, Lord Blackthorne. Expect wind." "I hired you because you know how to keep your feet when the deck tilts." Edmund met the older man's eye, and for a moment the two recognized in one another something rare in London, a refusal to speak softly about real things. "I shall do the work," he said simply. "I know," Blackwood returned, equally simple, "and Miss Worthington shall do hers. Between you, perhaps you will convince my children that character is a better engine than reputation." He straightened, already on his way to the next task. "There will be people who call this house scandalous. I mean to render the word ridiculous. Good afternoon. The afternoon thinned into evening. Clarissa descended in time to take tea with the family, where she was introduced to a ritual that was both familiar and altered, rounds of bread and butter, currant buns, but also a fragrant infusion that glowed amber and lifted the room with cardamom and clove. Harriet chattered to her as if they had been conspirators for years. Josephine produced a list, already annotated, of instruments she proposed to master. Margaret asked for permission to organize the household library. Thomas sat straighter than he thought he did and pretended not to care. Mrs. Blackwood watched Clarissa drink and did not miss how her hands stabilized around the cup. When Clarissa finally found herself alone again, night had dropped lightly over the square. She had been shown the schoolroom, had handled the fresh slate pencils and the neatly stacked copybooks, had run her palm over the maps that smelled faintly, intoxicatingly, of ink and intention. She stood at the threshold and understood, with a clarity that made her almost laugh, that this was hers, not by right, perhaps, but by labour, by presence, by skill. She would earn tomorrow and the day after, and if London preferred its small cruelties to her small uses, London could kindly take its opinion to some other drawing-room. In her chamber she unfastened her gown, laid it with care across a chair, counted the fastenings out of long habit, poor women's arithmetic, learned in a better house, and stood a moment in her shift, feeling the room welcome her without judgment. Sleep, when it came, was not the shallow thing that had lately kept her merely from despair. It was the heavier, kinder sleep of a person who has work before her and a door she can close. Across the square, Edmund wrote a brief letter to his sister, the first in weeks that did not read like a report from a siege, and then sat for a while with no book open, no glass poured, no lamplight except the one on the desk. He did not think of his mother, who would not forgive. He did not think of the clubs that had shuttered quietly without explanation. He did not think of the house he no longer visited on Sundays. He thought instead of a child's hand reaching unafraid for a stranger's, and of a woman's voice answering questions without flinching, and of a compass needle recovering its north. By morning the city had washed its face and arranged its hair in precise curls of smoke. The first cartwheels struck the stones with a rhythm that belonged to the living. Clarissa dressed, buttoned, pinned and tied, with hands that remembered swifter motions than fear. She left the veil on the table, glanced at it, and let it remain. At 9 o'clock precisely she entered the schoolroom. Edmund had arrived a minute before and was standing by the window, the light lifting the silver in his hair. He inclined his head in greeting. She returned it. The children tumbled in as children do, and suddenly there was no room for ceremony, because there were things to be learned and mischief to be preempted, and a bun to be rescued from Harriet's determined march toward havoc. The day began. It began with the alphabet of a new household, with schedules and quills, and a lesson on the polite fiction that one waits one's turn while secretly aching to speak. It continued with Euclid on the board and a small debate about whether a sentence can be both honest and kind, and a break during which Harriet tried to convince the pear tree to produce fruit by telling it all the best parts of yesterday's story. It included a moment when a boy who had learned to brace for correction found himself praised not because he had been right, but because he had changed his mind when presented with a better reason, an achievement rarer than accuracy. And it ended with ink-stained fingers and the profound satisfaction which sometimes visits people who have, for one day, done the exact work they were made for. When Clarissa closed the door of her room that evening, she did not look at the veil. She did not need to. She sank into the small chair by the small fire and pressed one palm flat against the cloth of her skirt, feeling the pulse under it, her own, ordinary and defiant. Below, somewhere in the house, she heard a young person's laughter break into a run. In the next room, she imagined, though she had no reason to suppose it, Edmund laying out the next day's books as soldiers are laid out before a campaign, quietly, with respect for both the enemy and the cause. They had not spoken more than necessary. They had not confided. They had not even, strictly speaking, met. At least not in the sense society would script. Yet something had been agreed upon without words, a willingness to inhabit this experiment, to fold their bruised selves around an ordinary purpose, to be, for a handful of children and an honest household, the adults that rumour had insisted they could not be. It was not love, it was better for the moment. It was the unlikely meeting of two lives who had been told there would be no more beginnings and who had, without ceremony, begun. The first week arranged itself into a quiet grammar of hours and intentions, and within that grammar Clarissa and Edmund learned each other's cadences without presuming to speak them aloud. At 9 the children arrived, bringing the draught of weather and the smell of the street. At 11 there was the clatter of cups from the side table and the flourish of the bun knife. At 1 the schoolroom exhaled the frenzy of minds that had been made to stretch and now required food. Beneath those visible marks a subtler order took hold, a slate left with a row of elegant numerals and a comment in a firm, unadorned hand. Josephine's reasoning is sound. Encourage her to defend it aloud. And beneath, a second note in a smaller, precise script. Done. She rises to the argument like a swimmer surfacing. The conversation began in chalk and pencil and occupied the generous margins of the day. It started with courtesy and proceeded by that slow courage which belongs to people who have been made to distrust swift things toward trust. Clarissa discovered his handwriting as one discovers the structure of a new language. The strokes spoke of economy, of a mind that despised fuss, but had a tenderness for clarity. His comments on the children were exact without being diminishing. He never wrote wrong, he wrote, "An assumption has slipped," as one might adjust a shoulder seam. Edmund, for his part, learned the timbre of her attention. Her annotations had the diligence of a devoted mind, but also occasionally a line of dry amusement in parentheses. Harriet believed 4 times 6 is a grown-up number and therefore obedient. Alas, evidence refuted her. He found himself smiling alone at the desk more than once, and was irritated with himself for the warmth that followed. If they met between lessons, it was in the morning room, where the small fire made a boundary against the rest of London. They stood at angles that preserved propriety, that allowed the peripheral vision to be faithful while the gaze could remain formally elsewhere. Discussing Thomas's appetite for geometry, Clarissa said, "He is less in love with Euclid than with the sensation that his mind is lifting a weight it could not lift yesterday." Edmund accepted the observation as if she had handed him a tool. Discussing Margaret's inclination toward order, he replied, "She wishes to master form so that she can ignore it at will. Let us see that she neither fears nor worships rules." When Josephine stubbornly declared algebra a house with too many rooms, Clarissa and Edmund, separately and then together, opened doors for her and left them unlocked. Harriet, who was 8 and a law of nature, bypassed experiment and report and went straight to conclusion. Miss Worthington and Lord Blackthorne liked the same sort of quiet. "Not the Sunday one where everyone is pretending," she told the pear tree during a recess lecture, but the listening kind. The pear tree, which had prudently committed to fruit in its own season, kept its counsel. On the third day, a rain came that began as a mist and matured into a sustained attack upon the city's confidence. By afternoon, the schoolroom windows were veiled in water, the panes trembling when a heavier gust leaned upon them. Lessons became a fort, books stacked, maps weighted, the children toiling with a cheerfulness that had a defiant edge. Clarissa moved among them with the evenness of a lamp carried steadily up a dark staircase. Edmund set aside Latin in favour of a problem about a farmer's field and a stream that cut a diagonal through it, and only afterward admitted to himself that he had chosen the problem because it allowed the proposition that a straight path is not always the shortest, an instruction disguised as a sum. At 4 o'clock, a thunderhead that had been loafing beyond the park decided to speak with authority. The first crack rattled the window latch. The second announced itself in the floorboards and the chest. Clarissa's head lifted. She inventoried faces with the skill of a woman who had once learned rooms to survive them. Harriet startled, then laughed, then observed with scientific interest that the thunder had elbows. Margaret set her jaw and placed her palm upon Josephine's wrist, which was trembling in a manner the owner had not noticed yet. Edmund counted children without appearing to count. Thomas was not there. "Thomas," Clarissa called, light, as if asking whether anyone had seen a pencil. Silence returned the question with an echo. She and Edmund moved at once, their decision having been rehearsed privately in each of them, as surely as the fire drill in a theatre. "You take the east corridor," he said. She nodded, and was gone even as he finished. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, received Clarissa's quick request to remain with the girls, and installed herself upon a chair as if she had always been there. The corridors branched and narrowed. The house surrendered its noises to the storm. The outside was insistent. Clarissa tried study, morning room, library, paused, and then stepped softly into the library, already knowing. The storm had iron and memory in it. She had learned how children steal away to make private treaties with fear. There, behind the second alcove, knees made tight within his arms, Thomas sat on the floor with Coleridge propped against his shins as if poetry could absorb lightning. He looked up, surprised and a little angry to be discovered. Then, seeing it was Clarissa and not a bracing, he let his head fall against the shelf. "I was only—" he began, and stopped, because he was 15 and explaining feelings to a woman was beyond both dignity and vocabulary. "You were only listening," Clarissa supplied, and went to sit on the floor with the formality of a queen taking a public bench. "It smells wrong," he said, after a moment, his voice turned inward. "After rain. In Bombay, there's this smell like, as if a stone were breathing, and jasmine and wood smoke, and the heat being—" he gestured, wretchedly inarticulate. "Released," Clarissa said. "As if the air has been carrying its burden and then lays it down." "Yes," he said, fierce with relief, because it is not small to have someone finish one's thought without stealing it. They sat, not touching, the storm continuing to explain itself outside. Presently a shadow lengthened on the rug. Edmund, who had searched the other half of the house in large, efficient arcs, found them. He stopped when he saw the boy's posture and altered his own so as not to crowd it. "You've located the only corner that does not object to thinking," he observed. "I prefer the other smell," Thomas said, frowning at the rug as if it had failed him. "I prefer it too," Edmund answered gravely. "There is mud in this thunder. In Bombay there is wet stone and spice. I cannot make London smell right, but we might, between us, make a small piece of Bombay in this room." Thomas looked up, suspicion and yearning in equal measures. Clarissa, feeling the balance, spoke carefully. "A corner. Maps of where you have been and where you wish to go. Books in Hindi and English. Fabrics to remind us that colour is not immodest but honest. A small box of things that belong to there and here. Stones, perhaps, and a brass cup, and a scrap of a sari rescued from the rag bag before some foolish person makes it dust cloth." Thomas stared, as boys do when they wish to conceal gratitude inside intellectual inquiry. "Does Mr. Blackwood permit—" he began. "Mr. Blackwood intends it," Edmund said. "He hired a governess who knows the cost of lies and a tutor who knows the cost of truths. He can survive a carpet in the wrong colour. A flash, a crack that arrived as the flash departed, a shudder in the glass." Thomas inhaled and let the breath out, not as a gasp, but as a count. Edmund crouched, feet wide, soldier's balance, and rested one forearm on his knee. His voice was gentler than usual, as if he were speaking in a church, not because of ritual, but because of respect. "Homesickness is a keen tutor," he said. "It teaches you where the walls of your soul are, but it is a poor master. We will not let it be master." Clarissa reached, not to the boy, but to the shelf above his head, taking down an atlas that had acquired dust it did not deserve. The move carried her hand past Thomas's shoulder. He did not flinch. She felt, absurdly, as if she had been allowed to pass a border post without bribe or interrogation. "We will need a table," she said, "preferably one with a scar, so we can add to it without guilt." "We will conscript the old writing desk from the back attic," Edmund answered, already making an inventory of the household in his mind, and then, because he was learning without being taught, he turned to Thomas. "You know the attics," he said. "Show me the way." They rose. As they did, Clarissa's hand and Edmund's crossed at the height of the atlas, both reaching to steady the slope of pages. For a breath of time, thin as gold leaf, the backs of their fingers met. The shock was not fire, not the careless lightning of scandal or abandoned propriety, but warmth, like the first competent match struck in a long winter. The touch was gone almost before nerves could take their own testimony. What remained was an awareness that seemed to bend the air. Edmund stepped back with the startled dignity of a man who has remembered suddenly that he possesses a heart. Clarissa placed the atlas upon her palm as if it were something living, and the three of them negotiated the awkwardness by pretending to consult the index. Within the hour, the schoolroom learned its new border. Mrs. Henderson produced a rug whose pattern refused to be English and therefore suited the purpose. Josephine fetched pins and wax. Margaret, hands brisk and eyes bright, arranged the maps with the precision of a general. Harriet contributed a small tin elephant that had no provenance beyond love and refused to explain itself. Clarissa secured a strip of sari silk along the edge of the table, so the universe remembers it has colour, and no one corrected her. Thomas, whose jaw had set itself in a grim square, felt it soften, and did not resent it. He looked from Edmund to Clarissa to the odd little nation they had declared in that corner, and said, "It is not enough." "No," Edmund agreed, "but it is a beginning." The storm spent itself as storms must. The evening came in cleaner than one might expect. When the children had been delivered to baths and supper and all the domestic alchemies that render a household a civility, Clarissa and Edmund lingered a minute in the schoolroom, as strangers do outside an inn after a journey, reluctant to part before naming the road. "You were right," he said, looking not at her, but at the table, because a man is allowed his guard as much as a woman is allowed her veil. The boy needed a place to put his longing. "Everyone does," Clarissa answered softly. "Some of us use rooms, some of us use work." She paused, and then, struck by honesty before caution could veto it, added, "Some of us use people we are not allowed to have." The words dropped into the quiet without splash. They were too light to drown, too heavy to drift. Edmund's breath lifted, held, and released. He turned his head a fraction. Quietly, as a gentleman asks a widow to dance, he said, "And some of us learn to name what we may not take. Naming can be a form of mercy." She inclined her head. It was all the agreement propriety permitted. Mrs. Henderson's steps in the corridor delivered them from the danger of sense. The house settled around them with its new furniture of intention. It would have been easy to imagine the next days as a gentle slope, but life prefers stairs. With the corner established, the children's energies reoriented. There was more to desire. Josephine wrote a list titled "The Things We Will Learn Before People Tell Us We Cannot." Margaret began drafting a library catalogue that committed the heresy of sorting books by the questions they answered rather than the century they were printed. Harriet appointed herself ambassador to the pear tree and reported, with disappointment, that stories increased bees but not instant fruit. Thomas, caught between boyhood and the first outline of the man he would be, worked at his Latin with a will that was no longer stubbornness but choice. The household noticed. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the place with a kindly tyranny, took to leaving a bowl of dried hibiscus in the schoolroom for colour when the world forgets itself. Cook sent up cardamom biscuits and observed to no one that cinnamon cannot accomplish everything. Mr. Holroyd, whose stillness shaded into watchfulness when harm hovered near, revised the footman's rota, so the schoolroom corridor kept a dignity that resembled privacy. The house itself seemed to acquire a new pitch, a hum at which well-meant work vibrates. As for London, it had not yet decided what to do with the rumour that the Blackwoods household had collected 2 fallen stars. Some stirred the story like a pot. Some, more generous or more careless, let it cool. In the meantime, there were dinners to be prepared, accounts to be balanced, 1,000 small municipal indecencies to be committed and forgiven. Scandal does not starve on its own. It requires feeding. Blackwood's friends preferred meat. On the 8th day, when morning scissored a clean shadow across the schoolroom table, Edmund arrived to find a new sequence drawn on the slate in Clarissa's hand, a rhythm exercise in which the children were to write 3 sentences, one true, one kind, one useful, and then interrogate the overlaps. Beneath it, she had left a note. They tell each other truths too sharply. They tell themselves falsehoods too gently. He stood, regarding the sentences, and felt the satisfaction one feels upon hearing a well-made clock strike, rightness without ostentation. He wrote, "Agreed. Today I shall assign them to praise in Latin and criticize in English. The first slows the impulse to wound. The second preserves the precision of the wound when it must be given." When he set down the chalk, he realized his hand was steady. He had not noticed when it became so. In that same hour, Clarissa stood at the window of her small sitting room and noticed that she had not thought of Devonshire in 2 days. Guilt tried to lever itself under the recognition. She would not let it. One can carry a grief honourably without wearing it like a uniform. She had written to her parents with careful affection, neither blaming nor pleading, and had received in return a letter that spoke of the vegetable garden and their health, and included, almost shyly, a pressed foxglove from the hedge. She placed it between the pages of a book of sermons and did not read the sermons. The second week brought domestic theatre. Mrs. Blackwood, who understood that children required rehearsal for society the way dancers required it for the stage, announced a dinner, not a grand one, but one calibrated perfectly to the nerves of pupils and tutors alike. Not the sort of guests who count the spoons, she told Clarissa in the sewing-room, where they were mending with the brisk intimacy of women who avoid sentiment by biting off thread, but the sort who bring their own to lend if yours are low. Traders. A barrister who married for love and now prosecutes for justice. A woman who repairs porcelain and refuses to call it menial. People who know the price of sugar and the price of silence and prefer to pay the former. Clarissa's breath misstepped and was steadied by Mrs. Blackwood's hand, competent and cool, closing briefly over her wrist. "You will not be an employee that evening," she said. "You will be our guest. If the world cannot manage that distinction, the fault is not yours." Edmund reacted to the invitation with a sensation not entirely unlike dread, which he chose to categorize as prudence. He had worn evening clothes in rooms that had delighted to condemn him. He had acquired an involuntary flinch toward overt civility. And yet he found, when the hour came, that the sight of Clarissa descending the staircase in a gown of simple lines and serious colour, that deep burgundy which did not beg favour but deserved notice, cancelled several of his more morbid predictions. He did not allow his face to arrange itself into admiration. He did not need to. Mrs. Henderson observed on his behalf, with the mercy of a woman who knows when a man is not to be mocked, "There now," and adjusted the angle of a candle so the silk threw light upward. The dinner did what Blackwood intended. Talk ran in channels cut by interest rather than pedigree. Wit did its noble work of preventing opinion from hardening into creed. Edmund's sense of self, which had been compelled in St. James's to shrink to a line, resumed its proper volume. Clarissa found herself cornered not by malice, but by genuine curiosity. A tea merchant's wife wanted to know, with the delicious practicality of her kind, what lessons would be designed for a girl who had more use for numbers than for embroidery. Clarissa answered without apology. Across the room, Edmund listened to the cadence of her mind and nearly forgot to pretend he was not listening. Music coaxed the evening toward gentleness. Josephine played with surprising poise. Harriet fell asleep upright and slid sideways into Clarissa's lap like a letter dropped into the right postbox. Edmund watched Clarissa's hand stroke the child's hair, and felt, with an ache that had nothing in it of torment and everything of hunger, a vision of a domesticity he had assumed was permanently closed to him. A small head on a woman's lap. A house that laughed before it criticized. Privacy that did not mean loneliness. He took himself in hand. Longing is a stranger whose passport must be examined. But for the first time since his divorce, he did not hand it back with a stamp of refusal. He placed it under consideration, and in doing so felt the world tilt by a degree. Not all tilts are gentle. The following week brought a ragged patch of weather, the sort of days that tear umbrellas and make a city abrupt. The children chafed at confinement. Thomas, whose nerves were tuned to a finer pitch than he liked to admit, grew short and then sorry, a combination familiar to any man of 16. Clarissa guarded her patience as a miser guards coin and spent it exactly where it would profit. Edmund, whose temper had learned to bite only when bidden, bled off the boy's restlessness upon the cricket pitch in the mews, where physics and the satisfaction of a bat making clean acquaintance with a ball combined to resemble therapy. It was on the fourth of these wet afternoons that the moment arrived which later, in a different household, would be called the beginning. They were alone in the schoolroom, the children having been swept away to a fitting for new winter shoes by a maid who had the power of a bailiff, when the silence between them took on a character that was not absence, but presence. Edmund stood at the end of the table. Clarissa rearranged papers not for order, but to occupy her hands. Their glances sketched polite arcs away from each other and returned of their own accord. He moved first, though without intention, to the globe on the stand. "There is a satisfaction," he said lightly, "in seeing the world made obedient to a sphere." "And a lie," she replied, equally light, "because no line has ever been drawn so neatly upon water." "Most of the lines we obey are nonsense," he said, surprised to hear the thought aloud. "Some nonsense is merciful," she returned, and then stopped, because the door opened and the room filled with safe commotion. Harriet, of course, reneging on the fitting to report that the shoemaker had a dog with a white eye like a marble, and could it be taught to wink? The interruption saved them from naming something that, if named then, would have been too soon. There is a pace at which trust ripens that should not be hurried. Even so, when later he handed her a sheet of figures and their fingers touched again, brief, almost apologetic, neither of them pretended not to notice. The days that followed wove intimacy with reserve as skillfully as a sari weaver lays gold into silk. They began to know ridiculous particulars, that she scattered pinholes along the edge of a paper when thinking, that he smoothed an invisible crease upon a book's spine before opening it, that she laughed without sound when truly amused and with sound when protecting someone else's dignity, that he could not bear to see a child flinch when a door closed. He learned that she preferred to teach fractions with pairs rather than with pies, because pairs resist being cut into smugly equal wedges. She learned that he taught Cicero's periods as if they were marches, with drum and rest and trumpet. The children, possessing the divining rods granted always to the young, registered a change they could not have described. Margaret's posture improved by a fraction when Edmund entered, as if a violinist had tuned the string another quarter turn. Josephine grew fearless in challenge when Clarissa stood near, as if the vicinity of one woman's composure could animate the courage of another. Thomas saw in Edmund's face an expression that he had not previously associated with men speaking to women: consideration without avarice. Harriet announced to anyone who would listen that Miss Worthington and Lord Blackthorne were, like the two ends of a ribbon, they keep the package together. At supper, Mr. Blackwood and his wife exchanged the sort of glance only married people can move through a room without breaking. "We are throwing them into the world," Mrs. Blackwood murmured over the teapot, meaning the children, "and providing them perhaps with an example of how to make a world if the world one is given fails." "Examples are expensive," Blackwood replied, spooning sugar he did not need into his cup. "We can afford it." The city beyond the square would soon have its say. For the present, the house was an island that bred its own weather. There were mornings when the light fell in a benign sheet across the map of Hindustan. There were afternoons when the fire retired into itself and merely held coals, both of them working within earshot of each other's breath. There were moments when their eyes met across a small distance, heavy with acknowledgement, and then turned away with an equal quantity of safety. There was, above all, the slow, ordinary accumulation of shared labour, the most stubborn and faithful engine of attachment the world has ever devised. On a Friday, 2 weeks after the thunderstorm, a note lay upon the schoolroom table in Clarissa's hand. "I have told Josephine that she may debate you on the proposition. A truth told without love may be poison. A lie told in love may be poison also. She is prepared to be victorious." Beneath, Edmund wrote, "Then I shall come armed." Below that, Clarissa added, "With arguments or with biscuits?" And he, after a pause and an extremely brief grin that no one witnessed, returned, "Both." They met that afternoon on the field of battle. Josephine fought with valour and ate 2 biscuits, as the defeated generally do. Edmund declared that anyone who could distinguish between love and cowardice at 12 had already performed a greater intellectual feat than any Latinist. Clarissa declared that anyone who could lose graciously at 12 had been given an excellent teacher. They were not looking at each other when they said these things. They did not need to. And somewhere between Josephine's third point and Harriet's decision to crown the globe with a wreath of paper leaves, they became, without ceremony, a we. It did not consist of confession. It did not yet consist of promise. It consisted of the unquestioned knowledge that the work of the day would be divided in 2 and the burdens likewise, and that each would be safe in the other's competence. For people who have been made unsafe, this is the beginning of love, whether or not the word is admitted. It would have been pleasant to insist that the world allowed such beginnings to flourish in peace. It would also have been false. London, as all vigilant towns will, sniffed wind and caught a new scent. Someone who owed Adelaide Piton a favour repaid it by transporting her malice in a covered basket to a breakfast table where envy eats so naturally it requires no salt. The story, precisely wrong and exactly shaped to sting, moved with the efficiency of a plague germ. But that is another chapter. For now, on the eve of the first testing, Clarissa returned to her room, laid her hand upon the veil she had not needed all day, and left it where it lay. Edmund, in his own house, stilled the habit of clenching his right fist before sleep, and woke in the night because his hand had not hurt. In the morning, the schoolroom would be bright again, and a child would answer a question more bravely than she knew. Between thunder and rumour, there had been this clear interval in which 2 people long acquainted with ruin began to build something that could withstand weather. The brittle peace of the Blackwood household did not last. Rumour has the stamina of a hound and the cruelty of a hawk, and one afternoon in Hyde Park it found Clarissa again. She had agreed, hesitantly against her instincts, to accompany the children on an outing, Edmund at her side. The air was bright with the sharpness of autumn. The leaves underfoot crunched like brittle paper. For an hour the outing was almost ordinary. Harriet chasing after ducks, Margaret practicing her hauteur on unsuspecting passers-by, Thomas observing rowers with a tactician's eye, Josephine demanding to know why girls could not row just as well as boys. Clarissa had begun to allow herself the smallest seed of satisfaction, thinking that perhaps she might survive society's gaze if she kept to shadows. Then Adelaide Piton appeared. She swept toward them with a phalanx of fashionable ladies in her wake, every feather in her bonnet trembling like a drawn sword. The smile she offered was lacquered cruelty. Her words were louder than courtesy permitted, calculated to reach every ear within a dozen yards. "Why, Miss Worthington, out in public, how very bold! One would have thought discretion might have been learned after your escapades." Her eyes flicked to Edmund. "And Lord Blackthorne, of course. What a pair!" The divorced and the disgraced, truly, misery does love company. Clarissa felt the blood drain from her face. The children gathered close, instinctively protective, though they could not understand. Little Harriet slipped her hand into Clarissa's. Thomas placed himself half a step in front of Edmund. The insult was not new, but it was freshly sharpened by being uttered before the children. Clarissa opened her mouth and found no words, only the old helplessness rising like a tide. Edmund, however, did not hesitate. His voice carried with the weight of a man long accustomed to being heard in Parliament and now entirely indifferent to whom he offended. "Madam," he said with terrible courtesy, "it is curious that you speak so freely of betrayal when your own husband is renowned in Covent Garden for his boasts of unwilling conquests. I recall the very evening, 3 years past, when he bragged of a lady's resistance overcome. Perhaps you were occupied elsewhere and missed his triumph." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. The colour drained from Adelaide's cheeks. Her companions shifted, uncertain, their appetite for scandal soured by the sudden prospect of its teeth turned upon them. Lady Jersey, ever pragmatic, developed an urgent errand and withdrew. The others followed like leaves in a gust. Adelaide stood alone, trembling with rage she could not display, then fled without another word. But the damage was done. By nightfall the tale had doubled back through Mayfair, embroidered with every poisonous thread malice could devise. Now the story was not merely that Miss Worthington was shameless, but that she and Lord Blackthorne conducted an affair beneath the very roof of the respectable Blackwoods, corrupting innocent children with their example. Clarissa spent the night in tears, packing the few belongings she owned, determined to resign at once rather than bring further disgrace upon the household that had offered her refuge. Edmund stormed into Mr. Blackwood's study to resign as well, arguing that his presence had worsened her plight. Mr. Blackwood thundered against them both, insisting he had hired them knowing full well what society whispered and caring not a whit. But gossip is a fire that consumes more than truth. The Blackwoods received word that their standing in clubs and drawing-rooms would not survive unless the governess and tutor were dismissed. The children wept, clinging to Clarissa, begging her not to leave. Mrs. Blackwood pleaded reason, while Clarissa stood pale and resolute. She could not, she would not permit her ruin to become theirs. Edmund, driven beyond endurance, made the declaration that shocked even himself. He would marry Miss Worthington. Marriage would silence the worst of the rumours, give her the protection of his name, and remove any shadow from the Blackwood household. He spoke the words with the steadiness of a man delivering a parliamentary argument, but his eyes betrayed the passion beneath. He could no longer endure to see her suffer. Clarissa refused at first. She would not be his duty. She had endured enough chains. She would not forge new ones for him out of pity. It was Harriet, solemn with the wisdom children sometimes bear, who blurted the truth. "But you do love each other. I see it. You look at her like Papa looks at Mamma when no one is watching. And she smiles only when you are here." Out of the mouths of babes came the revelation neither had dared to name. Left alone at last, Clarissa and Edmund faced each other without veils, without sarcasm, without the armor of restraint. He confessed that his offer, though couched in practicality, was born of love long denied. She admitted that through his eyes she had rediscovered her own worth. They spoke haltingly, then with rising urgency, of their fears and their hopes, of the possibility that two broken reputations might form one unbreakable life. By evening they had agreed. Theirs would not be a marriage of convenience, but of courage. If society demanded their exile, they would build a life outside it, together. 3 weeks later, they stood in a small country chapel with only the Blackwoods, a handful of loyal servants, and Edmund's defiant sister Isabella as witnesses. Clarissa wore the burgundy gown Mrs. Blackwood had gifted her, garlanded with orange blossoms from the estate's hothouse. Edmund, sombre and radiant at once, spoke vows that were less ritual than promise. To guard, to honor, to love. The children played their parts with solemn joy. Margaret as bridesmaid, Thomas as groomsman, Josephine at the pianoforte, Harriet scattering petals with anarchic enthusiasm. The air was thick with the scent of roses and redemption. News of Adelaide Peton's final ruin, her husband's debts collapsing her household, reached them that very day, but it mattered little. Gossip had lost its sting. They had chosen each other. They would face whispers and cold shoulders, but they would do so hand in hand. For the first time in years, Clarissa felt not the weight of disgrace, but the lift of freedom. Edmund, once hardened by betrayal, felt laughter return to him like spring after a bitter winter. Together they began not a retreat, but an advance, into love, into labor, into a life of their own making. They married as the year tipped toward winter, under a sky the color of pewter and a wind that smelled of rain. And then they began the quiet, difficult work of making a life. There was no procession afterward, no public tour of congratulations. The carriage that bore them back to town rattled over stones that had known other couples more celebrated and less certain. Clarissa sat with her gloved hand in Edmund's, no flourish, simply the fact of fingers joined, and regarded the familiar outline of London with a steadiness she had not possessed before. Marriage had not magicked away the world's appetite for contempt. It had given them instead a room they could lock and a name they could share when they faced contempt together. They returned to the Blackwood house not as employees, but as family. Mrs. Blackwood greeted Clarissa with a kiss placed at the exact point on the cheek where comfort enters the body most directly. Mr. Blackwood gripped Edmund's shoulder with the wordless approval of a man who knows a risky purchase when he sees one and admires courage more than certainty. The children cheered in a disorder that would have humiliated a governess and thrilled a woman who had once been a governess. Harriet climbed Edmund as if he were a newel post, and whispered, with the secrecy of the unsecretive, that she had prayed God would tie them. Thomas shook Edmund's hand with a gravity that startled the boy himself, as if some invisible transfer had occurred. Margaret presented Clarissa with a list of household improvements that might be enacted now that sense reigned. Josephine simply leaned against Clarissa's side and stayed there, like a decision. Isabella Blackthorne, Edmund's sister, arrived the next day in a curricle that terrified postboys and thrilled grooms. She embraced her brother with a fierceness that acknowledged both the wounds he had taken and the stubbornness with which he had refused to die of them. When she turned to Clarissa, she did not offer the delicate condescension of a lady to a woman of lesser safety. She offered the frank allegiance of one soldier to another. "I was not asked to give consent," she said, eyes gleaming, "and would not have given it if I had been, on principle. I offer celebration instead." The household rearranged itself around the new fact. Clarissa and Edmund took rooms not high under the eaves, but on the second floor, where the windows admitted a proper portion of daylight and the fire took naturally. The joining of their lives made a subtle change to the house's music. It acquired a counterpoint. There were mornings when their voices could be heard arguing amiably about whether Josephine should be permitted to study algebra beyond the comfort of a clergyman's wife, and evenings when light under their door suggested the kind of conversation in which two people lay down their armor and do not miss it. The schoolroom became not merely a workplace, but a workshop for futures, Blackwood's first, but not exclusively. For there emerged, as if it had been waiting behind their marriage vows, an idea that would not be content to remain an idea. It announced itself, like many necessary things, as a question Clarissa could not stop asking. How do we give a child what we did not have when we most needed it? The Blackwood children had made progress within the safety of their father's wealth and their mother's courage. But beyond that roof stood an army of households where girls were trained to be fragile and boys to be hard, where rooms rang with untruth spoken in polite voices, where a mind that did not arrange itself agreeably was punished rather than honed. It would not do to have rescued themselves only to preside over a refuge. They wanted a road. They began with a trial. 2 afternoons a week the schoolroom opened to a handful of pupils drawn from families Mr. Blackwood trusted. Merchants' children, a barrister's niece, a printer's son whose hands perpetually bore ink like honor. The fee was modest, the conditions precise. Clarissa set the terms with an authority that would have amazed the girl who had once constructed petitions. No child comes to be emptied and filled. They come to be sharpened. If a parent prefers a pliant mind to a true one, let them seek another house. Edmund wrote the prospectus in a hand the world had once associated with votes recorded in Hansard, and now learned to associate with a different kind of franchise. On the first day, the room filled, awkwardly at first, then with a release that resembled joy. Edmund began as he meant to proceed. Here we speak so that sense becomes visible. Here we listen so that truth does not have to shout. Clarissa followed, her voice not louder but nearer. Here, if you are wrong, you are not shamed. You are given the honor due to anyone brave enough to attempt. They hung on the wall between a map of Hindustan and a sketch of the Thames drawn by Josephine, a phrase that became the household's creed. Character is a better engine than reputation. Work gathered to them, and with it resistance. The house that traded courage invited criticism from houses that traded on custom. There were letters penned by people who had never met them and never meant to, anonymous naturally, accusing them of turning children into radicals by teaching them to infer. There were insinuations in drawing rooms that the tutor and his wife had turned the Blackwood establishment into a salon for discontent. There were even, absurdly, offers to purchase the schoolroom concept and make it respectable, by removing anything that made it necessary. They refused to be made respectable. They accepted, instead, the work of creating a place in which a child might recover their wholeness. And the children did. Margaret, someday to be a woman whose decisions would not wait behind a husband's shadow for permission, learned to test rules as one tests a bridge. Step, listen, step again. Josephine fell in love with number and, more dangerously, with proof. Harriet, who approached the world as someone approaches a friendly dog that might bite, discovered that stories are also tools and that tools require care. Thomas grew into a young man who could argue without cruelty and yield without humiliation, an art rarer than translation and more urgent. The marriage itself moved according to a quiet calendar of firsts. The first time Clarissa woke in the night and did not reach instinctively for the veil that no longer hung by the bed. The first time Edmund spoke of his former life without bitterness clenching his jaw and found that memory did not own him. The first time Isabella arrived at breakfast with news of their mother, a woman more committed to appearance than to love, and Edmund did not resolve to be hard because she had been. The first morning, Clarissa looked at herself in the mirror and felt her face arrange itself not into defence, but into readiness. They had their quarrels, as any honest marriage does. They quarrelled about method, whether a child should be compelled to copy lines as penance for insolence. Edmund said no. Clarissa asked for the lines to be of poetry rather than platitude, and thereby transformed punishment into apprenticeship. They quarrelled about money, whether they ought to accept a donation from a shipping firm notorious for cheating sailors. No, said Clarissa. No, said Edmund. Faster. They quarrelled about honour, whether Edmund should answer an insult from a former acquaintance who sneered in a club window as they passed. The quarrel lasted until supper, when Edmund set down his knife and said with the humility of a man learning a new grammar, "I think my pride imagines it is courage." Clarissa, who had left her plate untouched, reached for his hand and replied, "And mine imagines it is prudence." They ate then and laughed, and amended the household's creed with a private footnote. Pride and prudence are the easiest disguises. Watch them. One evening in early spring, when the city's trees pretended to leaf out of duty rather than conviction, a crisis arrived as they always do, without knocking. A boy from the afternoon class staggered in late, his cheek bruised, his lip split, with a note pinned untidily to his coat by a father who had written in a furious hand and a broken heart. The boy had spoken back in a workshop when an apprentice taunted a girl for being a girl. The foreman had struck him for insolence. The father demanded to know whether the schoolroom taught boys to make trouble. Edmund took the boy by the shoulders and sat him gently. Clarissa dismissed the class, closed the door, and read the note twice. "I will go," Edmund said. "You will not," said Clarissa, already securing her cloak. "You are his teacher. You cannot also be his quarrel. Let me be his scandal." She went down into that workshop like a flame lowered into a dark place. She spoke to men who had not expected a lady, and then not expected sense, and then not expected to be themselves treated as men could wish to be treated. She did not accuse the father, who had come at last and stood with fists unclenched but not unready, of betrayal. She acknowledged the misery in him. She named the injustice without making it a play. She did not leave until the foreman shook her hand and the father nodded once, and the boy, seeing his mother's fear on the threshold, stood a little taller because his teacher had not stood for him, but with him. When she returned, wind-bitten and steady, Edmund felt admiration join love like a second fire catching. He sat with the boy while Clarissa made tea that was more remedy than beverage. Later, when the house slept, he drew his wife against him with that particular tenderness men reserve for the women who make them better than they are. They did not speak much. Bodies remember what words cannot explain. That same spring, a letter found them from an unexpected quarter. An invitation from a small parish school on the edge of the city to come and speak to a gathering of teachers who wished to learn how to protect children's minds from cruelty without turning them into creatures merely armed with reproach. Edmund read the letter aloud with the expression he wore when something mattered and he wanted to pretend it did not. Clarissa listened with her hands in the dishwater and then dried them, and then said yes. They spoke in a cold hall that smelled of chalk and dog-eared hymnals, to men and women so tired the backs of their shoulders seemed to beg for sleep. Edmund spoke first, clean phrases, hard edges softened by use. He confessed, because honesty had become their only advertising, that he had once believed brains lived best in rooms where pain was invisible and success was the only accent. He said gently that he had been wrong. He explained that rigor without kindness to steady it breeds meanness more efficiently than scholarship. He pointed to a boy in their school who had learned, under Clarissa's patience, that the state of being wrong is not mortal. The teachers listened as one listens to a method of making bread that will not waste flour. Clarissa spoke after, quieter, closer. She said she had been saved by a room. She said she intended to make such rooms until she could not stand. She said that if a house could become a room, a street could, and a city, and perhaps a world. She did not quote scripture because there were men in the room who would have used it as a weapon, but she did quote the fact every woman knows, that to make a future you must be allowed a table, a chair, a book, and an hour unmolested. When she finished, there were no cheers. There was a shift in the air, that movement humans make when they have acquired a task. The work, once defined, multiplied. A printer offered to publish their pamphlet at cost. A merchant's wife organized a subscription to pay for girls who had brothers who did not have sisters. A stonemason sent a note in a hand like quarried granite. If ever you should need steps. They found that they did indeed need steps, literal ones, up to a second-floor room in a neighboring house Mr. Blackwood purchased and pretended to have always owned. The school outgrew its cradle and stood, a little wobbly, but upright. It was not all forward motion. Their reputations, though less raw, still drew flies. There were days when Clarissa walked through the square and felt the old itch between her shoulder blades that announces a gaze taking notes. There were days when Edmund received letters that recommended suicide without having the courage to sign their advice. There were nights when worry about money engaged them both like a petty creditor who knocks late. But in the main, the balance stayed on the side of purpose. In summer, they went to the country at Isabella's command, a week on her small estate where apple trees and candour grew unchecked. They rose early and walked fields that had not learned to lie. They read aloud on quilts until the light became honey. They let the quiet do its good work. One evening, under the improbable luxury of an unclouded sky, Isabella said, with that particular impertinence granted to sisters, "You are both less haunted." Edmund looked surprised, as men do when someone has looked at them with attention they have not requested. Clarissa did not look surprised. She had felt the ghosts fall behind. They were not gone. They were mannerly now, content to follow at a distance and whisper only when asked. In autumn, rain returned, and with it a small grief that looked larger to the one who carried it. Harriet, older by nearly a head, declared that she no longer required stories before bed. Clarissa nodded and did not correct the lie. She began leaving books at the end of Harriet's bed instead, the way one leaves bread for birds one has taught to feed themselves. Thomas left for Cambridge with a trunk full of sensible clothes and a book of poems hidden inside one of his boots. He kissed Clarissa's hand like a son and embraced Edmund like a man who cannot say what he owes in less than a lifetime. Margaret took charge of the household library without imagining that she should ask. Josephine began, with the confidence of 12, to draft a constitution for the school. And then, because time delights in its own speed, the year turned again, and they found themselves celebrating an anniversary that felt somehow both improbable and inevitable. Mr. Blackwood insisted on a dinner so noisy that all solemnity failed at the door. Mrs. Blackwood gave Clarissa a shawl from a trunk she kept for occasions at which a woman needs to feel that another woman approves of her. Isabella toasted them with a speech that caused the footmen to turn their faces away, not from derision, but because they were suspiciously fond. Someone produced a ridiculous cake onto which a confectioner had piped their motto in sugar. The letters sagged a little and were better for not being perfect. Edmund, who had once been praised in rooms without hearing, stood and thanked them with a voice that steadied as he spoke. He said he had learned at last to begin his sentences with "we." Later, when the house dozed under the gentle tyranny of satisfaction, they excused themselves. In their room the fire made the kind of friendly noise that declares a hearth is not a performative device, but an actual source of heat. Clarissa unpinned her hair, which had always refused to remain where society put it. Edmund removed his cufflinks with the care of a man undressing not for bed, but for truth. They stood a moment at the window, shoulder to shoulder, as is the privilege of those who have made it so. London lay below, still vast, still indifferent, still dangerous, still full of rooms in which children would not be safe. The knowledge did not diminish them, it steadied them. "Do you regret?" he asked softly, as if he were asking a question of the dark, so the answer would not be frightened. "That your life did not become what you were told it would be?" She was quiet, because honesty had become the only language they trusted. "I regret," she said slowly, "that the girl I was had to learn so much so hard. I do not regret being the woman who learned it." She turned then and lifted her hand to his face with the authority of a queen and the care of a nurse. "Do you regret," she countered, smiling, because she knew and asked anyway, "that truth cost you so much?" "I regret," he said, a little hoarse, "that I did not know sooner which costs are investments." He kissed her palm, not as gallantry, but as sacrament. This one was. They banked the fire and did what married people do when tenderness and respect have been cooking together so long the house cannot tell them apart. The tenderness had no drama in it. The respect had no stiffness. It was an ordinary miracle with an extraordinary pedigree. Two human beings who had been told they were unsalvageable salvaging each other daily. The next morning brought the next work, as mornings do. Clarissa drafted a letter to a widow whose daughter she intended to sponsor. Edmund prepared notes for a talk he had agreed to give to a group of apprentices who wished to learn how to disagree without the factories collapsing. Mrs. Henderson brought in a tray and scolded them, gently and efficiently, into eating. Mr. Holroyd announced, with what passed in him for excitement, that a parcel had arrived containing a small press of their own, acquired by subscription. They took their places, husband, wife, colleagues, and the day took its place around them. Years later, enough years to turn children into people with occupations and mothers into women with dresses that no longer fastened at the same hook. The school would have a name carved above its door that humbled them: Blackthorn Worthington, House for the Making of Minds. The carving was done by the stonemason whose letter had once promised steps. When the sign went up, Edmund laid his hand against the cool, quarried letters and thought of the first day he and Clarissa had agreed to be a we. Clarissa watched a line of girls ascend those steps, shoes polished, braids tied with practical ribbon, and thought of the night she had slept without fearing the morning. If you had asked them then, with the eminence of hindsight making fortune appear like intention, what they believed their legacy to be, they would have demurred. It was not the building whose brick would someday weather and whose windows would fog when 100 small bodies exhaled winter. It was not their names, one borrowed, one reclaimed, although names matter. It was something smaller and therefore more durable, a phrase repeated in 100 rooms by 1,000 voices until it became the house sound of a city. Character is a better engine than reputation, and a practice stitched beneath it. That people are not the worst thing said about them, nor the worst thing done to them, that a room can teach this, that a day can prove it, that a life can advertise it by the way a man holds a door, and a woman holds a silence. Near the end of that first great season of their life together, Clarissa found, in the pocket of a shawl she had long since mended, the crumbling remains of a pressed foxglove, the one her mother had sent months ago from the Devon hedge. She took it to the schoolroom when the children were away, set it upon the map table, and looked at it as one looks at an old wound after the scar has gone pale. Edmund came in, quiet as always in rooms where thought sleeps. He stood beside her and did not speak. "It taught me," she said at last, "to look for bells where there are no towers." She smiled and shook her head at herself. "Nonsense, but there it is." "Some nonsense is merciful," he answered, and the old phrase arrived in the room like a friend who had travelled far to be present at a small, important occasion. He lifted the fragile flower as if he were picking up a child who had fallen asleep in an inconvenient place, and together they laid it between new pages in a book the school kept for beginnings. Outside, the city made its usual sounds: iron on stone, dogs, milk carts, the creak of a sign against its bracket. Inside, the air held the clean scent of unburned coal and fresh paper and the faint, persistent sweetness of cardamom. They stood a moment longer, not in triumph, but in confirmation. The ruined spinster and the disgraced lord had built, plank by plank, a house that weather could test and rumour could not enter. The door, once barred, now opened outward. And beyond it a road. They took it,